It was 1923 in Sunflower County, Mississippi, a land where the air itself carried the weight of fear, and every shadow held a whisper of danger. Cotton fields stretched endless beneath a swollen moon, their white blooms glowing ghostly in the dark. In the small black settlement known as Elmwood Hollow, faith was both shield and weapon. The people there, sharecroppers, preachers, widows, and children, had learned that survival wasn't about running. It was about standing still when the earth trembled beneath your feet. At the heart of it all was Sarah Whitfield, a young widow whose husband had died for speaking truth to power. She lived in a modest cabin at the edge of the fields, 2 children at her side, and a will forged in grief. Every night she watched the road that cut through the trees, the same road where the Klan was said to ride when they wanted to remind the world who ruled Mississippi. But Elmwood Hollow wasn't like other towns. These people had seen too much, lost too much, and prayed too long to bow anymore. That summer, the Klan burned 2 churches and a farmhouse. The message was clear: leave or burn next. But this time, no one packed, no one ran. They gathered instead, whispering psalms and sharpening resolve. For the first time, the night itself seemed to lean closer, waiting to see what would happen when fear met fire and refused to move. That was the night when Sarah Whitfield and the town that had buried too many sons decided to stop burying their courage. The night when every trembling hand found its strength. The night when white supremacy came riding into a storm it could not tame, and met the fury of a people who would rather burn than bow. The night began like any other in Elmwood Hollow, quiet, heavy, and watchful. The moon hung low over the cotton fields, its pale light spilling across the rows like ghostly fingers brushing the earth. Cicadas droned in the distance, their hum weaving through the air like a warning too old to ignore. Inside a small cabin at the town's edge, Sarah Whitfield sat beside a dying fire, mending a tear in her son's shirt. Each stitch was deliberate, each pull of the thread a small act of defiance against a world that wanted her undone. Her children, Ruth and Daniel, slept on the floor, their faces soft in the amber glow. The wind outside shifted, and with it came that old unease, the one every black mother in Mississippi could feel before. Trouble came calling. Far down the road, a light flickered once, then vanished. The sound followed, faint, deliberate, cruel. Hooves, slow at first like a heartbeat learning its rhythm, then faster, then stopping. Sarah rose, her fingers tightening around the fabric in her lap. She crossed to the window, the boards creaking under her feet, and peered through the thin curtain. The fields were still. The trees stood in prayer. But somewhere beyond them, she knew, something was moving. Something that carried the weight of hate and history behind it. She reached for the shotgun by the door, Elijah's old weapon, its wooden handle worn smooth by his hands. Her breath steadied, her pulse slowed. The night had come alive, and she was listening. Across the town, lanterns began to glow in windows, one by one, small halos of courage cutting through the dark. Men stepped out onto porches, rifles in hand. Women gathered their children close, but did not hide. From the church, the sound of a hymn drifted low and steady, a melody too soft to challenge the night, yet strong enough to remind it that they were still here. "Ain't no one runnin'," a voice whispered from the fields. "Not tonight." And for the first time in generations, Elmwood Hollow stood as one, not as victims, not as shadows, but as keepers of their own fire. The sound came first, a distant rumble that rolled across the dark like thunder too proud to hide. Sarah froze by the window, the thread of silence pulling tight across the room. Then came the light, faint at first, then brighter, swinging through the trees like the heartbeat of something wicked. The road that led to Elmwood Hollow was narrow and unpaved. a strip of pale dust cutting through the black fields, and now that dust rose like smoke as the riders came. 6 of them at least, maybe more, their horses kicking up the dirt, their white hoods catching the moonlight. They moved in formation, slow and steady, torches, unlit, but rifles glinting at their sides. It was the quiet that made it worse. No shouts, no laughter, just the rhythm of hooves and the low creak of saddle leather. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she leaned closer to the glass, her face a ghost in the reflection. She could see them now, clearer, their robes shifting like ghosts stitched from hatred. Her heart pounded, but her eyes didn't move away. Fear, she realized, had a sound, and tonight it was coming for her. Down the road, other cabins stirred to life. A door opened. A dog barked once before being hushed. Old Reverend Carter stepped out from his porch, lantern in hand, his shadow long and trembling against the dirt. He didn't run. None of them did. Word had spread that the Klan was coming again, that Elmwood Hollow would be wiped clean before dawn. But the people of that small town had already made their choice. Sarah could see them gathering near the crossroads, men and women together, silent, but armed, shotguns, pitchforks, old pistols handed down from fathers long buried. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and in a world that had taken everything else, that was enough. Sarah's neighbor, Martha Lewis, walked out into the road, her white headscarf catching the moonlight. She stood in front of her porch, arms folded, staring down the oncoming storm as if she'd been waiting her whole life for it. The riders reached the edge of town and stopped. The lead horse snorted, pawing at the ground, uneasy under its master's hand. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Sarah could see the man at the front straighten in his saddle, his hood tilting as he surveyed the small cluster of lights that marked Elmwood Hollow. His voice, when it came, carried like oil over water, slow, cold, and meant to wound. "We warned you people," he said, his tone dripping with false calm. "We told you to clear out. You had your chance." A murmur rose from the dark, not from fear, but from anger, low and steady like the sound of a coming tide. Sarah felt her grip tighten around the shotgun. For months they had buried their dead in silence. Tonight, the ground itself seemed to rise against that silence. She whispered a prayer not for safety, but for strength. "Lord," she breathed, "if they mean to bring fire, let them find it waiting." And as the riders dismounted, stepping into the mist with their torches flaring to life, the people of Elmwood Hollow braced for a reckoning generations in the making. The first torch cracked as it caught flame, a burst of orange cutting through the blue mist like a wound torn open in the night. The riders fanned out, their shapes blurring in the haze, white robes moving like restless spirits through smoke. Sarah could smell the kerosene before she saw it, thick, bitter, a promise of destruction. Her pulse steadied into a rhythm that matched the drum of her heart. One beat for fear, one for fury. She turned from the window, her eyes sweeping over her children where they slept by the hearth, and for a moment she saw their faces as Elijah's, the same stubborn chin, the same quiet fire. She knelt, brushing a curl from Ruth's forehead, and whispered, "If I say run, you take your brother and head for the river. Don't stop till you hear the morning birds." The words felt heavy in her mouth, ancient and necessary, like a ritual passed down through the blood of every mother who had ever known the sound of boots on dirt. Outside, the air thickened with the hum of hate. The riders moved closer, their torches high now, flames reflected in the dark glass of Sarah's window. One man, taller than the rest, his robe streaked with dust, stepped forward, his voice a knife cutting through the night. "Bring her out!" he shouted. "Bring out that colored widow who thinks she's bigger than the law!" The words echoed through the fields, bounced off the cabins, hung heavy in the air. From the church came the slow toll of the bell, 1, 2, 3, not a call of surrender, but of warning. Sarah's neighbors stirred, shadows moving through doorways, shapes emerging from the dark. Martha stood again at her gate, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. Reverend Carter raised his Bible, his voice trembling but firm. "This is the Lord's ground," he called, "and no man with hate in his heart will claim it." His words rippled through the air like the first roll of thunder before a storm. Sarah moved to the door and placed her hand on the latch. Every memory of Elijah, every humiliation swallowed in silence, every night spent wondering if tomorrow would come, it all gathered in her chest and hardened into resolve. She wasn't just one woman anymore. She was the weight of every injustice her people had carried, and the proof that they had not been broken. As the riders advanced, she lifted the shotgun and cocked it, the metallic click echoing through the cabin. "You come through that door," she said softly, "and you'll meet the Lord before the sun does." The fire outside flared, the riders froze, and in that single suspended moment, the balance of power shifted, just enough for the night to remember that fear cuts both ways. The first blow struck the door with a thunder that shook the cabin to its bones. Dust rained from the rafters, the lamp flickered, and Sarah's heart slammed once, hard, then fell into rhythm. The second hit followed, louder, angrier, wood cracking under the weight of boots and hate. "Come out, woman!" a voice barked. "You can't hide behind no prayers." Sarah stood still, the shotgun resting against her shoulder, her breath shallow but steady. She could hear Ruth whimper softly behind her, Daniel clutching his sister's hand. She didn't turn. "Stay low," she whispered. "Stay quiet." The words came out calm, but inside her chest, fire was blooming. Outside, laughter rose, ugly, hollow, the kind that carried across generations. "Ain't no man here to protect you now," one of them sneered. Sarah's jaw tightened. "There's a God here," she muttered, "and that's enough." A shadow passed across the window, quick, deliberate. Then came the hiss of kerosene pouring onto the porch. Sarah's stomach turned cold. The smell of it filled the air, mixing with sweat and smoke. She closed her eyes for half a second, saw Elijah's face. The day he died, how they called it an accident, how the sheriff refused to write the truth. Rage rose inside her, clean and hot. The next kick shattered the lower panel of the door, a jagged hole opening near the floor. Through it, she saw a flash of white cloth and the glint of a torch. Her hands didn't hesitate. She raised the shotgun, her arms trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do. The world seemed to slow, the sound of the wind, the pop of fire, her own heartbeat, until all that existed was the moment between breath and defiance. She squeezed the trigger. The blast tore through the stillness like judgment itself. The man at the door fell back with a cry that ripped the air open. The torch flew from his hand, landing in the dirt, its flames sputtering out in a hiss of smoke. For a second, no one moved. Even the horses froze, their nervous snorts the only sound. Then came the shouts, panicked, disbelieving. "She shot him! God Almighty, she shot him!" The men scattered, their formation broken, their courage leaking into the night. Inside, Sarah stood motionless, the smell of gunpowder filling the room. Smoke curled from the shotgun barrel, glowing orange in the firelight. Her hands shook not from regret, but from the holy shock of having survived her own fear. In that instant, she understood something that could never be unlearned. The hunted had teeth, and the world would remember the bite. The silence that followed the gunshot was not peace. It was disbelief, raw and dangerous. Then, like a wound torn open, rage spilled from the men outside. Boots pounded against the porch again, voices barking orders, torches flaring high into the black sky. "Burn it down!" someone screamed. "Smoke her out!" Sarah's blood ran cold, but her mind was sharp. She turned toward the children, her eyes blazing with both terror and command. "Under the floor! Now!" she hissed. Daniel obeyed first, pulling Ruth's hand as she lifted the rug near the hearth to reveal the small trapdoor Elijah had built years ago. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, pressing her lips to their foreheads. "And no matter what you hear, you stay." Ruth's eyes were wet, but she nodded. Sarah closed the hatch, the wood swallowing their small faces, and turned back to the flames, beginning to lick the porch rails. Outside, the men cheered their own cruelty, the smell of kerosene thick and choking. Firelight flashed across their robes as they circled the house like vultures. Sarah crouched low, her lungs already filling with smoke, her skin slick with heat. She reloaded, each shell clicking into place like the turning of a clock, counting down to either death or deliverance. Through the cracks in the wall, she saw them. Shadows moving, shapes twisting in the glow. One man climbed the porch rail, shouting, "You should have run, gal!" Another laugh followed, harsh and wild, and then the sound of breaking glass as a torch came through the window. Flames spread fast, curling up the curtains, hungry and bright. Sarah ducked, coughing, eyes stinging as the room filled with orange light. The fire roared louder than the men now. She could feel it breathing, alive and furious, as if the night itself had taken sides. She moved with the precision of a prayer answered in motion, steady, defiant. When the second man stepped through the door, she fired again. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, the blast echoing across the fields. The figure fell backward, his torch scattering embers into the dirt. For the first time, the screams outside carried fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when monsters realize their prey can fight back. Sarah coughed through the smoke, eyes watering, and dropped behind the table for cover. Her house groaned and cracked, beams splitting, flames devouring everything she and Elijah had built. But she was still standing. Her hair clung to her face, her lungs burned, yet her spirit did not yield. "Not this home," she rasped through the haze. "Not this blood." And as the fire climbed higher, the night bore witness to something the Klan had never seen, a woman made of both smoke and fury, standing unbroken in the heart of her own burning house. The roof screamed as it gave way, sparks bursting into the sky like stars escaping the earth. Sarah stumbled backward, shielding her face from the heat. The air was alive, hissing, cracking, burning. The smoke poured through every crack, turning the world into a blur of orange and shadow. She could barely see the walls that had once held her life, the rocking chair where Elijah had sat, the quilt her mother had sewn, the Bible that had soothed her children to sleep. All of it was fire now, but through the roar, she could still hear the faint whimper of Ruth beneath the floorboards, the trembling breath of Daniel, the small heartbeats that reminded her why she could not stop. She wrapped a wet cloth around her mouth, bent low, and began to crawl. The shotgun clattered beside her as she dragged it through the smoke, her knees bruised, her lungs burning. The house wasn't just falling, it was fighting her, its boards collapsing like bones giving way. Outside, the men had fallen silent. The fire had become their fear now, spreading faster than they could control. Two of them tried to pull the wounded away, their faces half lit by the flames. The rest hesitated, unsure whether to flee or finish what they'd begun. The world they had ruled so easily was suddenly unpredictable. One woman's defiance had rewritten the rules. From the edge of the fields, the people of Elmwood Hollow watched, torches of their own flickering to life. They didn't shout or move closer, they simply watched. A wall of eyes, unbroken and unblinking, bearing witness to what the night was doing in their name. It was no longer just Sarah's fight. It had become theirs. The firelight reflected in their faces, and for the first time, the Klan saw themselves not as gods of terror, but as men, afraid, outnumbered, and shrinking in the glare of their own cruelty. Inside, Sarah reached the trapdoor. Her hands trembled as she tore the rug aside and lifted the wood. "Come on, babies," she gasped, her voice hoarse from smoke. Two small faces emerged, eyes wide and wet. She pulled them out, clutching them tight against her chest, her tears cutting clean lines through the soot on her cheeks. The flames danced higher behind her, painting the yard in wild gold. She stumbled through the back door into the open air, collapsing to her knees beneath the old pecan tree. The children clung to her, coughing, crying, alive. The cabin roared behind them, its collapse a final, thunderous surrender. Sarah turned to watch it burn, her face illuminated by the inferno. There were no screams left in her, only breath, ragged but unbroken. Around her, the townspeople began to move closer, forming a circle of light around the woman who had turned her home into a battleground. The fire had taken everything built by hand, but what was left, the strength, the witness, the defiance, was untouchable. By morning, Elmwood Hollow was quiet again, but not the quiet of defeat. It was the stillness that follows thunder, when the air smells of rain and something holy lingers between the ruins. The house was gone, reduced to black ribs of wood jutting from grey ash, smoke curling upward like prayers that refused to die. Sarah sat beneath the pecan tree with Ruth and Daniel in her lap, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide but awake. The light of dawn fell soft across the field, touching the burned earth, gilding the destruction with mercy. Every inch of her body ached, her hands blistered, her hair singed. Yet she was alive, and in Mississippi, that alone was rebellion. She looked at the place where her door had once stood and whispered, "We're still here." The words came out cracked, barely sound at all, but they were stronger than any sermon. Behind her, a rooster crowed somewhere far off, stubborn in its normalcy, and she almost laughed. Life, relentless as ever, had come back for her. The first to arrive was Martha Lewis, walking fast down the dirt road with her shawl flapping like a banner. When she saw the smouldering ruins, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, then hurried forward, her old hands trembling as she reached Sarah's. "Child, they did this?" Her voice broke on the last word. Sarah nodded, her jaw hard, her gaze steady on the ashes. "They came for me," she said, "but they didn't take us." Martha knelt, tears streaking her weathered face, and held her friend close. "You ain't alone," she said fiercely. "Not no more." And as if summoned by those words, more figures began to appear. Men, women, children, stepping out from the fields and the trees, walking toward the smoke. They came in silence, carrying blankets, bread, tools. No one spoke of revenge. They came to witness, to rebuild, to honor what had stood and what had refused to fall. As the sun climbed higher, the road filled with quiet footsteps. Even those who had hidden in fear the night before came now, drawn by something larger than courage. The pull of a shared wound turned to strength. The sheriff's men would come soon, Sarah knew. There would be questions, accusations, lies, but for this moment, the power belonged to them, to the people who had knelt for generations and were now learning how to stand. A young boy from the church brought a bucket of water and poured it over the smoking boards, the hiss rising like a sigh of release. Reverend Carter stood beside Sarah, his voice low. "They'll call this blasphemy," he said, "a woman standing against men." Sarah looked at him, her face streaked with ash and resolve. "Then let them call it what they want," she answered. "God knows what it was." The preacher nodded, tears shining in his eyes. In that moment, the ruins behind them didn't look like an ending. They looked like an altar. By noon, the sound of hooves returned, slower this time, deliberate, carrying the weight of law instead of hoods. The sheriff rode in flanked by 2 deputies, his horse kicking up small clouds of dust that floated like ghosts above the burned ground. He was a thick man with sun-cracked skin, a polished badge, and eyes too cold to hold pity. He dismounted without a word, staring at what had once been Sarah's home. The smell of ash hung heavy, the ground still warm beneath his boots. Behind him, the deputies exchanged glances, their hands resting on their holsters. "You're a hard woman to find, Mrs. Whitfield," the sheriff said finally, his voice smooth but sour, the kind of tone that pretends to offer reason, but hides a threat underneath. "There's been talk. Says you shot 2 white men last night." He didn't ask, he accused. Sarah didn't stand. She sat with Ruth and Daniel beside her, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight as a blade. "Men came to my door," she said quietly. "They brought fire and death with them. I sent it back." The sheriff's jaw tightened, his thumb brushing the edge of his gun belt. "You best be careful how you talk, woman," he said. "Law don't take kindly to colored. Folk make injustice for themselves." Sarah's eyes rose to meet his, steady, sharp, unflinching. "And who does the law protect when it wears the same boots as the men who burn our homes?" The words landed like stones dropped into still water. The deputies shifted, unease flickering across their faces. One spat into the dirt, muttering under his breath, but the sheriff stayed silent. Behind Sarah, the townspeople had gathered again. Martha, Reverend Carter, the children from the church, their eyes all on him. He could feel their gaze, heavy as judgment, and for the first time the power tilted away from him. He cleared his throat, muttering something about investigation and disturbance, but the words carried no weight. When he finally turned to leave, the people did not move aside. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of quiet defiance. The sheriff hesitated, his authority faltering in the face of their stillness. "You think you can scare me?" he barked. No one answered. Even the wind seemed to stop listening. He swung onto his horse and spat in the dirt, the gesture more insult than courage. "I'll be watching you, Mrs. Whitfield," he called as he rode away. Sarah watched him go, her children pressed against her sides. "Then watch close," she murmured, not as a threat but as a promise. Around her the townsfolk began to murmur, not fear this time, but belief. They had seen something the sheriff could never unsee. A woman who had faced the Klan and still stood in the light of day. And in that realization, Elmwood Hollow began to understand what freedom could look like. Not loud, not safe, but alive, and standing tall in the ashes. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the fields, the church bell rang again, not in mourning this time, but in summoning. Its sound carried through the valley, rising above the hum of insects and the whisper of wind through the scorched remains of the cabin. One by one, the people came, men with hats in their hands, women holding children against their hips, elders walking slow but certain. They filled the small wooden chapel by the river until there was no room left to sit, only to stand shoulder to shoulder, hearts pounding as one. At the pulpit stood Reverend Carter, his hands trembling as he held up a charred, black-edged Bible, the same one Sarah had saved from the flames. His voice was low but steady. "This," he said, "is what faith looks like when it refuses to die." The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of bodies leaning closer. Sarah stood in the back, her dress still stained with smoke, Ruth and Daniel beside her, their small fingers gripping her own. "This woman," the Reverend continued, "faced hell at her doorstep and did not kneel. They tried to burn her faith, but all they did was light it brighter." His words rolled through the crowd like thunder wrapped in prayer. Heads bowed. Tears fell, and hands, rose, not in despair but in praise. Martha stepped forward, her voice breaking as she said, "If they come for one of us again, they'll find all of us waiting." A murmur of agreement rippled through the church, soft at first, then swelling into something larger, a rhythm of unity that shook the old wooden floor. Someone began to hum, deep and low, a melody older than memory. Others joined, the sound growing into a hymn that filled the night. I shall not be moved. Their voices climbed higher, blending grief and glory, until the walls themselves seemed to tremble. Sarah listened, her throat tight, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum of remembrance. For the first time since the fire, she felt the weight of her solitude lift. She wasn't alone anymore. Her courage had become theirs. As the last note of the hymn faded, Reverend Carter looked out over the crowd, his eyes bright with tears. "They will come again," he said softly, "but they will not find a people afraid." The congregation answered not with words, but with silence, the kind that says more than shouting ever could. When Sarah stepped out into the night air afterward, the stars were burning fierce above the delta sky. She looked up at them and whispered, "Thank you, Elijah. Your fire didn't die, it just changed hands." And somewhere in the distance, as if the heavens themselves were listening, a soft wind stirred the ashes back toward the light. The peace that followed did not last. Word spread through the county faster than a spark through dry grass. That colored widow shot the Klan. Some said she'd killed 2 men, others swore there were 3 bodies buried under the magnolias by the river. Truth didn't matter. Legend had taken root. And legends in Mississippi were dangerous things, especially when they wore a black woman's face. By the second week, whispers reached Sarah's door. The Klan was meeting again, humiliated, seething, ready to reclaim its terror. Men spoke her name in secret rooms, swearing that the South would not be shamed by a woman's defiance. But while hatred plotted, Elmwood Hollow prepared. Families moved their beds closer to the floor. Men cleaned their rifles under lamplight. Children were taught which trees could hide them and which paths led to the water. No one said it aloud, but every heart beat to the same rhythm. They'll come again. On the 5th night, the air itself seemed to remember the fire. The wind turned hot, restless, carrying the scent of pine and fear. Sarah sat by the window of her rebuilt cabin, smaller now, stronger, made with the hands of neighbors who refused to let her stand alone. Ruth and Daniel slept on the floor behind her, wrapped in the quilt Martha had sewn from burnt cloth and unspoken prayers. On the table beside her lay Elijah's shotgun and the Bible, both symbols of her inheritance, one for survival, the other for salvation. She wasn't waiting in fear anymore. She was waiting in faith, a resolve carved into her bones. Outside, the frogs fell silent, and the woods grew still. Then came the sound, the low, measured rhythm of hooves approaching from the north. Sarah rose, calm and deliberate. She stepped onto the porch, the cool night pressing against her skin, the moon rising full and solemn above the fields. And there they were, 6 riders, their robes pale in the mist, their torches unlit this time. They thought darkness would be their ally, that surprise would deliver what fire could not. The lead rider called out, his voice rough and trembling with anger. "Sarah Whitfield, you think last time was the end? You think you can shame us and walk free?" Sarah said nothing. Her silence filled the space between them, heavy as prophecy. "Come out," the man shouted. "Come meet your maker." Sarah lifted the shotgun, her voice steady and low. "He's already here," she said. And in that moment, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of oil and smoke, her own trap laid across the yard. The riders didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath them was already waiting to burn. The first spark came from Sarah's hands. She lifted the lantern from the porch rail. its small flame trembling in the glass, and whispered, "Guide my aim, Lord." Then she hurled it through the window, and the night exploded. The lantern shattered against the ground where the riders stood, and in an instant the fire leapt up like a living thing, swallowing the mist in gold and crimson. Horses reared, screaming, their riders cursing as the blaze caught their robes. "She's set the ground alight," one shouted, stumbling backward as the flames curled toward him. The air filled with smoke, with fury, with the sharp scent of burning oil. Sarah fired once, twice, the shots cracking through the chaos, echoing across the valley like thunder rolling from a vengeful sky. One man fell, another turned and fled, his torch dropping into the dirt. The horses broke ranks, terrified, scattering into the darkness. Sarah stood framed in her doorway, the firelight painting her in bronze and shadow, a figure torn from both scripture and rebellion. "You came for a woman," she shouted over the roar, "but you met a mother." Her voice carried through the burning field, fierce and clear, cutting through the men's panic like a blade through cloth. The remaining riders stumbled, blind from the smoke, unsure which way to turn. Behind them, the fire grew higher, a wall of living light that separated them from the cabin. Every flame was a memory of Elijah, every crack of gunfire a hymn of vengeance disguised as survival. Sarah's hair whipped around her face, her lungs burned with smoke, but her aim stayed steady. She was no longer just defending a house, she was defending a story. One that said the hunted could rise and the silenced could roar. The men who had once called her weak now fled from the sound of her strength. When the last of them disappeared into the woods, the blaze began to soften, the fire hissing as it sank into the earth. Sarah lowered the gun, her arms trembling with exhaustion, her breath ragged. The yard was littered with scorched grass, broken torches, and the smell of gunpowder. She sank to her knees, not in surrender, but in prayer, a deep, guttural whisper that rose from the very marrow of her soul. "You kept me, Lord," she breathed. "You kept us all." Behind her, the cabin door creaked, and Ruth appeared, small and pale in the dim light. "Mama," she said softly, "they gone?" Sarah turned to her, eyes shining with tears that refused to fall. "They gone, baby," she said, voice trembling but sure. "They gone." She pulled her children close, the fire still glowing behind them, and together they watched the dawn's first light cut through the smoke, a promise that no hatred could last forever. By sunrise, the smoke had settled low over the valley, hanging like a veil between night and morning. The yard was blackened, the earth scarred, but the cabin still stood, battered, charred along the porch rails, yet unbroken. Sarah sat on the steps with her children wrapped in blankets, the shotgun resting across her knees, the Bible pressed against her chest. The world around her smelled of ash and gunpowder, but beneath it lingered something new, something like peace. From down the road came the soft murmur of voices. The people of Elmwood Hollow were coming again, their footsteps slow but steady, their faces marked by awe. They had heard the gunfire, seen the glow on the horizon, and once more they came not out of fear but allegiance. When they reached her gate, they did not speak. They simply looked upon the woman who had faced death twice and sent it home empty-handed. Sarah met their eyes, her face calm, her spirit radiating something that words could not carry. The quiet power of one who had seen the abyss and refused to fall. By midday, word had already traveled past the Delta, spreading down rail lines and into whispers at train stations and churchyards, the widow who made the Klan flee. Reporters would come months later, calling her a symbol, a miracle, a myth. But to her people, she was something more sacred. She was proof. Proof that the night could be broken. Proof that the world could not keep burning them without eventually setting itself on fire. In towns as far as Tennessee and Alabama, sermons were preached in her name. Old men at barbershops told her story between the hum of razors. Young girls braided their hair and whispered, "That's Sarah Whitfield's courage in us." Her defiance became a gospel, her survival a psalm that crossed generations, and though the Klan rode again in other towns, something had changed in the rhythm of the South. Fear had begun to flinch. Years later, when Sarah was grey-haired, and her children grown, she still lived on that same patch of land where the fire had once eaten the sky. Visitors would come, curious to see the woman whose name had become legend. They expected to find a warrior, but instead they found an old mother with gentle eyes and hands, worn smooth by work. When they asked her how she had done it, how she'd faced the Klan and lived, she smiled faintly, looking toward the horizon as if seeing her husband's face in the wind. "Strength?" she said, softly. "That wasn't strength, that was love, and love, when it's cornered, learns to fight." The reporters wrote it down, not knowing that those words would outlive them all. For long after the ashes were gone, long after the fear had changed its shape, the story of that night remained. The night a small black town refused to flee, and white supremacy felt the fury of a mother's fire.